Hello, everyone. We are going to be looking at a parable out of the Gospel of Matthew today. We're looking at Matthew chapter 25, going to be looking at verses 14 through 30. So, just kind of a quick context on what's going on in this. It's as part of a cycle of parables, and a lot of the important context in this story is Jesus is butting heads kind of for the last time with the religious authorities. This is kind of the cycle of speeches in this final confrontation that's eventually going to lead to his death on a cross. Um, and so there is kind of that hanging over this story, and you'll see in kind of the interpretation of it that there's kind of some fierce points Jesus makes with that specifically in mind. More specifically, this parable we're going to read falls in with a couple of others that have kind of this apocalyptic tinge to them. The disciples have kind of asked him a little bit about the end of the world and this coming establishment of fullness in the kingdom. And Jesus largely is telling them, kind of, here's what I want you to be doing. There is going to be a time of waiting. There is going to be a delay between my work here and the kind of fullness, the coming kingdom. And the kind of discipleship apprenticeship lesson here is what we as his followers should be doing with our kind of time and our resources in that interim period. So kind of that context is important. Kind of a quick note, you've probably heard me say this before if you've heard me teach about how parables work. Parables, it's important to recognize that parables usually are kind of aiming at a single point. They work a lot more like kind of modern jokes in that, it doesn't really matter the details of the joke as long as you can kind of get that punchline right. The details and the telling of the joke aren't quite as important. And I mention this because I think parables, we can sometimes apply bad habits, probably ones we learned in, high school English about allegory, to saying, oh, okay, well, this, in this story, the master must represent God and the slaves represent us, and this is how God relates to us. And there are parables that work that way, but most of them do not. Most of them are kind of driving home a single intuitive point or driving home a single way of being. And so this parable particularly is kind of controversial if you read it allegorically. It says some things that are not distinctly true about God because God does not equal the master or whatever. So let's look as I'm going to read this to us for what is kind of the point about the spiritual life that we think Jesus is teaching us and trying to drive home. So again, I'm reading out of Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 14. This is usually called the parable of the talents. For just as a man leaving home on a journey summoned his own slaves and handed his possessions over to them, and gave 5 talents to one, and 2 to another, and 1 to another, each according to his peculiar ability, and left home on his journey, immediately the one who received 5 talents employed them in trade and gained another 5. Similarly, the one who had gained 2 gained 2 more. But the one who had received 1 went away, dug into the ground, and hid his master's silver. Then after a long time the master of those slaves comes and settles accounts with them. And approaching the one receiving the 5 talents, brought the other 5 talents forward, saying, Master, you handed over 5 talents to me. Look, I've gained another 5 talents. And his master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You were trustworthy over a few things. I shall place you over many. Enter your master's delight. Also approaching, the one with 2 talents said, Look, I gained another 2 talents. And his master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You were trustworthy over a few things. I shall place you over many. Enter your master's delight. And also approaching, the one who had received 1 talent said, Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering from where you did not scatter. And being afraid, I went away and hid your talent in the earth. See, you have what is yours. But in reply, the master said to him, You wicked and timorous slave, did you know that I reap where I don't sow and gather from where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have placed my silver pieces with the bankers. And when I came, I would have received what was my own with interest. Therefore, take the talent away from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, it shall be given, and shall be more than is needed. But from him who does not have, even what he has shall be taken away. And throw that useless slave into the darkness outside. There will be weeping and grinding of teeth there. So some just kind of just notes from my studies this week. One, I discovered that these talents is actually a weight. It's like a big pile of quite a bit of money, of silver. It sounds like. I guess I always had the image of this master handing them little coins, like here's your talent, here's your talent, here's your talent, right? And then they're supposed to go and do something more with that. But this is it's actually like several years worth of wages. So it's kind of a big pile of money. These are big investments. These are big responsibilities that they're given, not just these little single coins. You may have known that already, but for some reason I discovered I had kind of the wrong image in my mind. That said, again, there's a really strong trust here. The master recognizes I love this translation, peculiar ability of each of these guys. He knows that these are talented, using the English there, people. They are very capable. He gives them this money because each of them has the abilities and the knowledge to, in fact, use them in investment and to grow them as is his desire. And I think that shows some of the disappointment. And then finally, I just want to point out one last time, be careful of allegorizing this story because, we hear some pretty brutal things about this master. And there's been a lot of work recently done about kind of how this system works and sharecropping and the fact that he probably would have been an unjust character that most of Jesus' hearers would have recognized. And that is not to say that God is unjust, that God treats people or resources like happens in this story. So let's be a little careful about that one because we're trying to drive home a single point of what it is Jesus wants us to learn about the spiritual life in this story. Similarly, the resources being talked about here aren't necessarily money. I feel like I've seen that a lot over the years. If you start talking to people about a need or a way of serving, they almost always, reach down and pull out their checkbooks and start, all right, grudgingly, how much do I write a check for? And I don't think that's what's being talked about in this story. I think, not to say that money and our other resources aren't spiritual, because Jesus talks a ton about money and the fact that the way we use our money expresses what's in our hearts and what's in our souls. But I don't want us to equate resources just with money either. And I think largely that's not what's being talked about in this story. Just the innate talents, the ways we can serve people, the things we enjoy, those are all things that are also at God's service in the spiritual life. So looking at the story itself, it's largely a negative story, right? The bulk of the writing is the interaction between this master and this slave who has failed. But I do think there's some kind of important lessons to pull out of the positive ones before we get to this negative one as well. One thing that I kind of mentioned, but largely in this story, I think the resources are spiritual resources. They are the ways we understand and use the good news that God is at work in the world, that God has died and beaten the power of sin, that redemption and wholeness are available, the gospel. So I think that is one of the big resources being talked about. Also, just the spiritual giftings. God gives us the abilities, the insights we have that are always meant to be at his service and the service of other people. I think the positive side of the resources that's being talked about here, these resources that are given and expecting to be used, are spiritual, which I think we can see from kind of that punchline at the end of this parable, right? That those who have these positive spiritual resources, they're going to get even more. And those who have only these tiny little spiritual resources, they're not using the few insights and understandings of the gospel and of God in the world, even those things are gonna atrophy and take away. And so I do think one of the important implications in this story is if these are spiritual insights, if these are spiritual understandings of the gospel, is that they are not meant to be held onto or hoarded, right? That's what this final slave gets in trouble for. Um, they're meant to be used and risked in some ways. And I guess the metaphor I thought of was is like what they say about foreign languages, your non-native speech, or the use of an instrument. They say use it or lose it. Um, it's not like in either a language or an instrument you can sit down conceptually have the idea like you can addition, for instance, and then pick it up 20 years later, and then all of a sudden you can just play right where you were or speak in the same way. Those are things that atrophy if we don't use them. We have to keep practicing them to keep that skill set alive. And I think we can see a parallel with that here in both understanding of the gospel and spiritual giftings. Use them or lose them, right? These guys risked them. They used in the investing metaphor. They used them to make more. They used them to grow themselves, and so they were working the way they were supposed to. And so, if we're not sharing, if we're not serving with these, I think, spiritual insights, these spiritual giftings, these knowledge of how God works in the world, we will lose them over time. They will atrophy. We will have to kind of start over again because God does desire us to be using and sharing and growing those kind of spiritual pieces of it. And I think that shows kind of this. It shows this kind of progression there. So originally, the master trusts them. He trusts them with things that are important to them. And as they take ownership of them, they get how they can be used. They look and recognize the possibilities. There's some risk there. Like I said, they have to face the very real possibility of losing some of that money, of risking it so it can be grown. And so I think it's really important that responsibility piece, because that's again what we see lacking in this second servant. He doesn't grab it. He doesn't take responsibility for it. He just kind of wants to preserve and pass on, versus the other people who understand it and they make it their own and they use it well. And I just think that's an important metaphor for the spiritual life, because again, we're not called to be slaves. We're called to be the children of God. We're called to be the apprentices of Jesus himself. His expectation and his hope is not that we will just imitate, but that we will make it our own, that we will become masters in our own way, right? That's what an apprentice does. They follow and watch closely that they can master this set of skills. And I think that's what God desires for us as his children, not just to imitate him, but to make it our own, to make it unique in the way we live out the kingdom in our world. I think that's our privilege, and I think that's God's desire for us. Just like it is in these slaves in some ways. They took it, they made it their own, they got what they were supposed to be doing, and they used these resources well. So now let's look at this negative example of this kind of other servant. The other servant is condemned, I think, largely for fear, right? He's afraid of the master. He doesn't get the intention. He doesn't take ownership of what he's been given. He's just attempting to give it back as it was, not lose anything, not take any risks, not take any ownership. And I think a piece of that he's condemned for is he's listening to fear rather than the trust and the responsibility given him by the master, right? The master says, I think you're capable of this. It's not as big as some of these other guys, but I think you are capable of using these resources and growing these resources, and that's better than nothing, right? And so he's condemned because he listens to fear rather than the trust that the master is putting in him. I think there's a possibility maybe he just felt like, well, I'm not as talented as those other guys, right? I'm not as adept as those other guys. I didn't get 5, I didn't get 2. But I think there is an important lesson there, because we fall into that a lot of the time, right? Like, well, I'm just not smart enough. I'm not spiritually deep enough. I don't know what to do with what's in the world. And yet I think God's response to this servant was, I gave you 1 because you're capable of it. And so I'm not sure any of us, no matter how small and stupid and unspiritual we feel, really get to listen to that voice, because God is saying, I have given you resources. I have given you things that are important to me that I trust you with because you're capable. You can do this. And so, which voice will we listen to? Will we listen to the voice say, I can't? Or are we going to listen to the voice that says, I trust you with this and you can do this? One of those obvious parallels there. He has the instinct of preservation. He thinks he's doing the right thing by not using it, by just giving it back. I do think that there's a shot here. I said earlier there's kind of this context of Jesus fighting with the religious authorities, right? They were doing so much to preserve the traditions they'd been given, to not lose anything along the way. And one of the reasons that Jesus drives them crazy is he keeps innovating, right? He keeps coming up with new expressions of these old truths, of new ways that are helpful and flexible in the lives of real people. And this just drives them crazy because their authority is largely based on this preservation. We were going to keep this exactly like it is, and you must do it our way. And I think this is a warning to the religious from all of time. It's not just a condemnation of Jesus' contemporaries. I think this is something that religious life has to be very careful of. We preserve our traditions and we want people to do it like we've seen, like that we want them to receive and get just like we were given. And this is condemned pretty heavily in this story. The master doesn't want his thing back. He gave it to him because he's capable of investing it and growing it. And then maybe that is a piece that's like God. God trusts us with things that are important to him. He gives us these gifts, not so we can just give them back. He doesn't want it back. He could have, he had it in the first place. He gives these gifts because he wants them to be used. He wants them to be grown. He wants them to have some investment in how it's doing. And we also see in here the slave is blaming the master, right? He says, well, I know who you are, and I was afraid because you're a terrible person. Therefore, it's not my fault. It's just the circumstances that happened to me. And so again, the positive slaves took responsibility, including what I think is some risk, versus him. He doesn't take responsibility. He doesn't take the opportunities given to him. He doesn't believe the trust that has been placed on him, and he tries to just preserve this thing and give it back. And the master isn't impressed because he knows he's better than that. And it's interesting that some translations say, he's too timid, he's afraid. Others say he's just straight lazy. He says it's the master's fault. He says he was paralyzed by fear and what could go wrong. But the master simply says, you were lazy. You didn't want to do the hard work of taking the responsibility and making it your own and seeing what it could be. You just wanted to preserve it and hand it back to me. And frankly, you've wasted my time and my money. And so I will give it to someone who knows how to use it. I will give it to someone who can make the best out of this. So these spiritual resources go from the 1 to the 10 who has this abundance because he knows how to use them. And so the lesson is really given to us in the context of waiting, the part we're in right now, waiting for the full restoration of the world, waiting for God's work to come to culmination and see everything. And so I think whether we feel like we're the slave who's been given one, whether we're one of the slaves who's been given a lot, we all have been given spiritual resources. Maybe these are the traditions we grew up in, things that are helpful and that are time-tested and powerful. Maybe these are our own experiences of God and spiritual experiences. They're the relationships we have with people, those who have mentored us, those we are mentoring, those we journey along with. They're our own insights into the heart of God and how God is working in the world. I don't believe that any of us is without things to teach. I don't believe that any of us is without some measure and gifting and spiritual insight of what God is up to in the world and wants us to be using. And so I think what we are asked to do is assess those and look at those again and remember what they are for. Use them, don't lose them, right? How do we grow them? How do we risk them? What are we capable of? And I think, breaking away from the story, it's very simply, we need to recognize that we're people. We're small, we're human, we make a lot of mistakes. And God is available, unlike the master in this story. God gives us these resources. He wants us to use them well. He wants us to thrive in them. So why don't we just ask, saying, God, guide me, give me the best use of these things. Let them be at your disposal and your will, because at the end of the day, the spiritual insights, the spiritual gifts we have been given, God desires us to take ownership of those and to use them to both serve Him and to serve other people. He doesn't want them sitting around not even in a bank somewhere. He doesn't want us burying them in the ground. He says they're there whether you feel like they're there for not. And they were meant to serve me and to serve other people. And so I think just like those other servants who had a sense of confidence and a sense of excitement that they're entering into the delight of this master, they did their job well. That is what I think God is inviting us into, no matter how crazy the times are, no matter how small and incapable we feel. I think God says otherwise. He thinks we are capable. He has given us gifts. Do we know what they are? Are we asking them? Are we asking Him how we can use them? And are we sharing them? Because that is what's going to make them grow and thrive as it will to us.